Welcome to Al-HASSANI Media. The full documentary about Prophet Muhammad.
The Quran yields little concrete biographical information about the Islamic prophet. It addresses an individual messenger of God, whom a number of verses call Muhammad. It also speaks of a pilgrimage sanctuary associated with the Valley of Mecca and the Kaaba. Certain verses assume that Muhammad and his followers dwell at a settlement called Al-Medina or Yathrib after having previously been ousted by their unbelieving foes. This expulsion presumably occurred from the Meccan sanctuary. Other passages mention military encounters between Muhammad's followers and the unbelievers, sometimes linked with place names, such as the passing reference to a victory at a place called Badr. However, the text provides no dates for any of the historical events it alludes to, and almost none of the Quranic messenger's contemporaries are mentioned by name. Hence, even if one accepts that the Quranic corpus authentically documents the preaching of Muhammad, taken by itself, it simply does not provide sufficient information for even a concise biographical sketch.
Most of the biographical information that the Islamic tradition preserves about Muhammad thus occurs outside the Quran, in the so-called Sirah literature. Arguably, the single most important work in the genre is Muhammad ibn Ishaq's Kitab al-Maghazi, or Book of the Prophet's Military Expeditions. However, this work is extant only in later reworkings and abridgments, of which the best known is Abd al-Malik ibn Hisham's Sirat Muhammad Rasulullah. This translates to Life of Muhammad, the Messenger of God. Ibn Ishaq's original book was not his own composition, but rather a compilation of autonomous reports about specific events. These events took place during the life of Muhammad and also prior to it, which Ibn Ishaq arranged into what he deemed to be their correct chronological order. He also added his own comments to these compilations. Each report is normally introduced by a list of names tracing it through various intermediaries back to its ultimate source. In many cases, this source is an eyewitness, for example, the Prophet's wife Isha. Variants of this material, as well as further information about Muhammad's life, are preserved in works by other authors. These include Abd al-Razak, al-Waqidi, Ibn Sa'd, and Al-Abar, enriching our understanding of early Islamic history.
The fact that such biographical narratives about Muhammad are encountered only in texts dating from the 8th or 9th century, or even later, is bound to raise the problem of how confident one can be in the Sirah literature's claim to relay accurate historical information. This is not to suggest that there was necessarily an element of deliberate fabrication at work, at least at the level of a compiler like Ibn Ishaq, who was clearly not inventing stories from scratch. Nonetheless, some accretion of popular legend around a figure as seminal as Muhammad would be entirely expected. At least to historians who are reluctant to admit reports of divine intervention, the problem is reinforced by the miraculous elements of some of the material included in Ibn Ishaq's work. Moreover, some of the narratives in question are patently adaptations of biblical motifs designed to present Muhammad as equal or superior to earlier prophetic figures such as Moses and Jesus. Finally, it is distinctly possible that some reports about events in Muhammad's life emerged not from historical memory, but from exegetically speculation about the historical context of particular verses of the Quran. By carefully comparing alternative versions of one and the same biographical narrative, scholars have been able to show that a certain number of traditions about Muhammad's life, for instance, an account of the Prophet's immigration from Mecca to Medina, were in circulation already by the end of the 7th century. Such evidence provides sufficient confirmation of the historical existence of an Arab prophet by the name of Muhammad. Certain tensions with the Islamic narrative of the Prophet's life remain, however. For example, some of the non-Islamic sources present Muhammad as having still been alive when the Arab conquerors invaded Palestine, in contrast to the Islamic view that the Prophet had already passed away at this point. All things considered, there is no compelling reason to suggest that the basic scaffolding of the traditional Islamic account of Muhammad's life is unhistorical. At the same time, The nature of the sources is not such as to inspire confidence that we possess historically certain knowledge about the prophet's life that is as detailed as many earlier scholars tended to assume. Especially the customary chronological framework for Muhammad's life appears to have been worked out by later transmitters and collectors such as Ibn Ishq, rather than being traceable to the earliest layer of Islamic traditions about Muhammad. Thus, statements of the sort that on March 21st of the year 625, Meccan forces entered the oasis of Medina are inherently problematic. The following section will nonetheless provide a concise digest mainly of Ibn Ishq's version of the life of the Prophet. This digest does not aim to separate historical fact from later legend. For instance, unlike many earlier Western accounts, no attempt will be made to remove supernatural elements from the narrative in the interest of transforming it into an account that appears plausible by modern historiographical standards. Biography according to the Islamic tradition Muhammad is born as a member of the tribe of Quraysh and the clan of Hashim. His hometown of Mecca houses an ancient and famous pilgrimage sanctuary, the Kaaba. Although founded by Abraham, worship there has over time become dominated by polytheism and idolatry. Muhammad's conception is preceded by a dramatic crisis. His grandfather Abd al-Mulib narrowly fails to implement a vow to sacrifice his favorite son and Muhammad's future father, Abdallah, an obvious adaptation of the biblical story of the binding of Isaac. Muhammad himself is born in 570, the same year in which the South Arabian king Abraha attempts to conquer Mecca and is thwarted by a divine intervention later alluded to in Surah 105 of the Quran. Muhammad's father passes away before his birth, leaving him in the care of his paternal grandfather, Abd al-Mulib. At the age of 6, Muhammad also loses his mother Amina, and at 8, he loses his grandfather. Thereupon, responsibility for Muhammad is assumed by the new head of the clan of Hashim, his uncle Abu Lib. While accompanying his uncle on a trading journey to Syria, Muhammad is recognized as a future prophet by a Christian monk.
At the age of 25, Muhammad is employed by a rich woman, Khadijah, to oversee the transportation of her merchandise to Syria. He so impresses her that she offers marriage. Khadijah is said to have been about 40, but she bears Muhammad at least 2 sons, who die young, and 4 daughters. The best known of the latter is Fima, the future wife of Muhammad's cousin Al, whom Muslims regard as Muhammad's divinely ordained successor. Until Khadijah's death some 3 years before Muhammad's emigration to Medina in 622, Muhammad takes no other wife, even though polygamy is common. Muhammad's prophetic initiation occurs at the age of 40. During a period of devotional withdrawal atop one of the mountains in the vicinity of Mecca, the angel Gabriel appears to him in an awe-inspiring encounter and teaches him the opening verses of Surah 96 of the Quran. Recite in the name of your Lord who creates man from a clot. Recite for your Lord is most generous. Muhammad is greatly perturbed after this first revelation, but is reassured by Khadijah and her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, a learned Christian who confirms Muhammad's prophetic status. Muhammad continues to receive revelations, but for 3 years limits himself to speaking about them in private. When God finally commands him to take up public preaching, he initially encounters no opposition. However, after the current proclamations begin to deny the existence of gods other than Allah and thereby to attack the religious beliefs and practices of the Quraysh tribe, tensions arise between Muhammad and his small circle of adherents, on the one hand, and the remaining inhabitants of Mecca, on the other. As a result, some of Muhammad's followers are forced to seek temporary refuge with the Christian ruler of Ethiopia. For some years, the other chief clans of Mecca even refuse to trade and intermarry with Muhammad's clan, since the latter continues to offer him protection. Sometime after the end of this boycott, one of the most famous events in the Prophet's ministry takes place, his so-called night journey, during which he is miraculously transported to Jerusalem to pray with Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and other prophets. From there, Muhammad continues to ascend to heaven, where God imposes on him the 5 daily prayers of Islam. About 619, both Khadijah and Muhammad's uncle Abu Lib die, and another uncle, Abu Lahab, succeeds to the leadership of the clan of Hashim. Abu Lahab withdraws the clan's protection from Muhammad, meaning that the latter can now be attacked without fear of retribution and is therefore no longer safe at Mecca.
After failing to win protection in the nearby town of Aleph, Muhammad secures a pledge of protection from a representative number of the inhabitants of the oasis town of Yathrib, also known as Medina. This promise enables Muhammad and his followers to leave Mecca for Medina, which, unlike Mecca, is partly inhabited by Jewish tribes. Together with Abu Bakr, the future first caliph, Muhammad is the last to depart. It is only because he is warned by Gabriel that he narrowly escapes an assassination plot by the Quraysh. At Medina, Muhammad has a house built that simultaneously serves as a prayer venue for his followers. He also drafts a covenant that joins together the believers and submitters, or Muslims, of Quraysh and of Yathrib, as well as some of Medina's Jewish tribes, into a community recognizing Muhammad as the messenger of God. However, relations with the Jews of Medina steadily worsen. 18 months after the emigration, a revelation bids the Muslims to pray in the direction of the Meccan Kaaba, rather than to continue facing toward Jerusalem as is Jewish practice. At about the same time, the Medinan Muslims begin raiding Meccan caravans. When, during one of these raids, they are surprised by a Meccan relief force at Badr in 624, the Muslims, aided by angels, score a surprising victory. In response, the Meccans try to capture Medina, once in 625 in the Battle of Yud and again in 627 in the so-called Battle of the Trench. Both attempts to dislodge Muhammad are ultimately unsuccessful. After each of the three major military encounters with the Meccans, Muhammad and his followers managed to oust another of the three main Jewish tribes of Medina. In the case of the last Jewish tribe to be displaced, the Quraysh, all adult males are executed, and the women and children are enslaved. In 628, Muhammad makes the bold move of setting out to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. The Meccans are determined to prevent the Muslims from entering the city, and Muhammad halts at Al-Hudaybiyah, on the edge of the sacred territory of Mecca. A treaty is concluded between the two parties. Hostilities are to cease, and the Muslims are given permission to make the pilgrimage to Mecca in 629. 2 months later, Muhammad leads his forces against the Jewish oasis of Khaybar, north of Medina. After a siege, it submits, but the Jews are allowed to remain on condition of sending half of their date harvest to Medina. The following year, Muhammad and his followers performed the pilgrimage as stipulated by the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah. Subsequently, however, an attack by Meccan allies upon allies of Muhammad leads to the latter's denunciation of the treaty with the Meccans. In 630, he marches a substantial army on Mecca. The town submits, and Muhammad declares an amnesty.
After his return to Medina, Muhammad receives deputations from various Arabian tribes who declare their allegiance to the Muslim polity. Still in 630, Muhammad embarks on a campaign to the Syrian border and reaches Tabuk, where he secures the submission of various towns. Muhammad personally leads the pilgrimage to Mecca in 632, the so-called farewell pilgrimage, the precedent for all future Muslim pilgrimages. He dies in June 632 in Medina. Since no arrangement for his succession has been made, his death provokes a major dispute over the future leadership of the community he has founded. Unsurprisingly, the figure of Muhammad plays a seminal role in Islamic thought and practice. In certain respects, his post-Quranic standing markedly surpasses the way in which he is presented in Scripture. For example, the Quran emphasizes that Muhammad, like earlier messengers of God, is a mere mortal, whereas Sufi thinkers of a speculative bent, such as Sahl al-Tustari, describe him as the incarnation of a pre-existent being of pure light, the Mohammedan light. The Quran also enjoins Muhammad to ask God for forgiveness of his sins, and one passage bluntly reproaches him for disregarding a blind man who came to you eagerly and in fear of God, and preferring to attend to someone who haughtily deemed himself to be self-sufficient. In contrast to such scriptural statements, in later centuries there emerged the doctrine that Muhammad and other prophets were free of sin and the belief that Muhammad exemplified the perfect human being. Another contrast between Quranic and post-Quranic images of Muhammad concerns the issue of miracles. The Quran cites Muhammad's opponents as demanding that he demonstrate his prophetic credentials by various miraculous achievements, such as being accompanied by an angel. In response, Muhammad is instructed to disclaim any pretense to possess the treasures of God, to have knowledge of the unseen, or to be an angel and is described as a mere warner. Thus, the Quran patently does not present Muhammad as a miracle worker. The later tradition, however, frequently depicts him as having possessed extraordinary knowledge of commonly inaccessible matters, often said to have been mediated by the angel Gabriel, and as having performed sundry supernatural feats. Thus, the enigmatic reference to a splitting of the moon in Quran 54:1 is interpreted to mean a confirmatory miracle that Muhammad performed in response to a challenge by the Meccan pagans. As a matter of fact, classical Islamic theologians routinely adduced Muhammad's miracles as one of the arguments establishing that he was a true prophet. In other respects, however, there is significant and crucial continuity between the Quranic and post-Quranic visions of Muhammad. Certain parts of the Quran, normally dated to the Medinan period of Muhammad's life, ascribe a much more elevated status to him than do earlier layers of scripture. Thus, the Quran demands belief in God and his messenger, and one verse ascribes to Muhammad two attributes, kindness and mercy, that the Quran otherwise reserves for God. Furthermore, God and his messenger must not be insulted, a demand that foreshadows the view of medieval Islamic jurists that insulting the prophet is a punishable offense.
Of particular importance are the frequent scriptural commands to obey God and his messenger, as well as the unequivocal statement that to obey Muhammad is to obey God. One Quranic verse even describes Muhammad as an exemplar to the believers. Such pronouncements form an important impetus for the later view that the custom of Muhammad holds normative significance for all Muslims, and that in working out God's commandments, Islamic scholars are to rely on prophetic precedent to supplement and interpret the relatively limited amount of legislation contained in the Quran. Al-HASSANI, who died in 820, influentially insisted that the prophetic sunnah was to be accessed by recourse to a specific corpus of texts, namely, extra-scriptural reports about the utterances and actions of Muhammad, the so-called prophetic hadith. The challenge of determining which of the multitude of such traditions could be deemed to be authentic already exercised pre-modern Islamic scholars, and led to a sophisticated philological weighing of the material, even though modern Western scholarship takes a rather less optimistic view of the feasibility of establishing the prophetic origin of specific hadith reports. Sunni Islam recognizes 6 quasi-canonical collections of authentic hadith, of which the most famous are those by al-Bukhari, who died in 870, and Muslim Ibn al-Ajj, who died in 875. Even beyond the strictly legal purport of Muhammad's example, the imitation of the Prophet has functioned as an important vehicle of ethical and spiritual growth for many Muslims across the centuries. Thus, pious Muslims through the ages have endeavored to follow prophetic precedent even in such seemingly mundane matters as using a toothpick or not trimming one's beard. The presence of Muhammad in popular Islamic piety is also anchored in festive commemorations of his birth on the 12th or 17th of Rab al-Awwal, during which the most famous panegyric on the Prophet, the so-called mantle poem by al-Biyar, who died in 1295, is traditionally recited in many Islamic countries. Other festivals associated with Muhammad are the commemoration of his night journey to Jerusalem and ensuing ascent to heaven, celebrated on the 27th day of Rajab, and his receipt of the first Quranic revelation toward the end of the fasting month of Ramadan. Muhammad's presence also extends to eschatology, for he is believed to have the power to intercede with God on behalf of the members of his community on the Day of Judgment. The confrontation of the Islamic world with modern Western imperialism, science, and historiography from the early 19th century onward has led to manifold rereadings and reimaginings of Muhammad's biography in scholarship, literature, and even film. A particularly influential 20th century biography of Muhammad is Eight Muhammad by the Egyptian writer Muhammad Hussein Haykal, who died in 1956. Haykal emphasizes the rationality of Muhammad's teaching and of the Quran and aims to clear the traditional Islamic sources on the Prophet's biography of what he perceives to be superstitious aspects. Muhammad remains an ideal character, although the ideals represented by him are strongly modernized. A much more daring literary adaptation of Muhammad's biography than Haykal's is Al-Ad Rattan by the Egyptian novelist Naguib Mahfouz, who died in 2006. This is an urban allegory of the history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Common motifs in modern and contemporary writings about Muhammad by authors from the Islamic world are the prophet's political and social vision, issues of gender, the nature of the revelations received by him, and his attitude toward the use of violence. Problems of historical authenticity and reliability, as well as the covert ideological tendencies underlying early Islamic sources are treated, for example, by the Moroccan sociologist and feminist Fatima Mernissi, who died in 2015, and in the Tunisian historian Hisham Jates, born in 1935, works on the biography of Muhammad. In striking contrast to the standard Muslim view of the Prophet as a perfect embodiment of virtue and piety, medieval Christian polemicists like the Dominican monk Ricoldo de Montecros, who died in 1320, condemned Muhammad as a deliberate impostor and a downright diabolical figure. Stock motifs in such polemics were Muhammad's recourse to violence, the number of his wives, and the alleged indebtedness of his religious message to a Christian heretic. This attitude changed only in the 18th century, when various Western scholars, for instance, the Dutch theologian and Orientalist Adriaan Rieland, who died in 1718, began calling for a more impartial assessment of Muhammad. The gradual shift is illustrated by the British Orientalist George Sales, who died in 1736, translation of the Quran into English in 1734. Even though its declared objective is polemical and the Quran is dismissed as so manifest a forgery, Sale at least leaves it open whether Muhammad's preaching sprang from genuine religious enthusiasm or only a design to raise himself to the supreme government of his country. To call Muhammad an enthusiast was to imply that he had been genuinely convinced of the truth of his message and of his own prophetic calling, rather than having deliberately ensnared the Arabs in false doctrines in order to satisfy his craving for power. Throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, the idea of Muhammad's subjective truthfulness and sincerity increasingly spread. A particularly emphatic rejection of the erstwhile predominant view that Muhammad practiced conscious deception is found in Thomas Carlyle's, who died in 1881, on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history. Given that a greater number of God's creatures believe in Muhammad's word at this hour than in any other word whatever, Carlyle wrote, it would be incorrect to dismiss Muhammad's preaching as a miserable piece of spiritual legerdemain. The valorization of the Islamic prophet was intimately tied up with the beginnings of modern Western scholarship on Muhammad and the Quran. According to Abraham Geiger, who died in 1874, whose was hat Muhammad Aus dem Judentum aufgenommen, constitutes the ancestral monograph of modern Western Quranic studies. Muhammad was a genuine enthusiast who was himself convinced of his divine mission. He so fully worked himself into this idea in thought, in feeling, and in action, that every event seemed to him a divine inspiration. Similar ideas were expressed by the German scholar Theodor Noldig, who died in 1930, author of the seminal Geschichte des Korans. Thus, the reconceptualization of Muhammad from a devious heretic to a sincere enthusiast paved the way for a novel scholarly interest in Muhammad as a major historical protagonist and in the Quran as an important document of human religious experience. This is so even if older Orientalist scholarship is by no means devoid of some residues of traditional Christian polemics.